Hey, welcome back to another episode of This Week in Christian History. We are glad to have as our guest today Dr. Daniel Hobbins, who's an associate professor at Notre Dame. And we are on the subject and the discussion of Joan of Arc. And we are focusing in on her martyrdom and as a way for us to be able to talk about her and who she was and what was important about that. It actually occurred on May the 30th, 1431, if we have the right info in front of us to do that. Does that sound like about the right time frame, Dr. Hobbins?
Yeah, it's either May 30 or 31. I think
Oh,
I'll
okay.
take your word for 31, but
Well,
yeah,
we're
that's
gonna
right.
we're gonna
It's
go
the
with
right
it
years, right?
happened this week. Okay, at least we'll just go with that of the week that we're focusing in on. So, tell us a little bit. We certainly want to know a little bit more about Joan of Arc and who she was and kind of her story about the things that we know, and as well as things that we probably, like most historians, there are some things we think we know. There are other things that we think we know, right, based off of whatever information is there. But it seems to me that the background of the Hundred Years' War is really kind of important for us to understand in context of that. So maybe we could kick off
Mhm.
with just some kind of a primer of that, maybe? Would that be
Sure,
okay?
sure, yeah. So 100 Years' War, 1337 to 1453. It's really more like a series of campaigns. You wouldn't think of it as kind of consistent war. There could be ye many years of truce in between these, fought between England and France and actually Burgundy.
Mm.
Which is no longer it ceased to be became part of France in the late 15th century. So we forget about that. England and France, of course, continue as nation states. So it's mostly fought in France. And for the first part of the Hundred Years' War, nearly all of the victories are English. And then in now these were campaigns that took place, as I said, in France, and what would happen is the English king would usually go on campaign for a few months, then some victory would happen for the English. Prisoners would be taken, and the English would go back home. And then a truce, in the truce, would England would get maybe control of more land, but English troops weren't actually occupying France, and we wouldn't think of it as a exactly as a territorial war in a modern sense.
Mm.
This changes, however, with Henry V, who becomes King of England in 1413, and he settles down to the business of actually trying to occupy France. And his great victory happens in 1415 at the Battle of Agincourt. That's famous from Shakespeare's play, and that's a disaster for France. And on top of so now northern France and then a few years later, even Paris comes under English Burgundian control. The Burgundians, that's another part of this. Now the Burgundians are actually allying after 1418. Uh, the Burgundians are allying with England. And so you have this Anglo-Burgundian alliance. A French king since 1392, Charles VI, who is uh, incompetent because he actually endures for months at a time. He'll have bouts of madness where he's completely incapable of ruling. And so there's now a power vacuum. And then he'll have periods of lucidity as well. But so you have the combination of really effective English rulers, really incompetent French rulers, and his reign lasts for a very long time. He doesn't die, Charles VI, I mean, King of France, doesn't die until 1422. And then he's succeeded by the Dauphin, as Joan calls him, Charles VII. So when Joan comes along, the Hundred Years' War is at a really dark period for France where England is allied to Burgundy, and Burgundy is a major, major player, very wealthy. All these northern industrial towns that produce a lot of wealth. Its capital at Dijon in what we think of today as France, but it's not
Mm.
contiguous. Burgundy is not contiguous. It's both in part of in modern France and then part of in the Low Countries. Um, and so so by 1429, Charles VII, the Dauphin, is faced with a situation where the English are now besieging Orleans, Orléans, on the Loire. And if that falls, the whole Loire Valley will fall. And Charles VII was actually considering abandoning France entirely and
Mm.
leaving the country and trying to almost like a situation with De Gaulle in the Second World War or something, where although he was no De Gaulle, let's be clear about that. He was not a very effective ruler. Um, and so this is the situation that Joan faces when she arrives at court, or when that France faces. And so a very dark period in French history. The Hundred Years' War had been, up until that point, pretty much a series of English victories. And then looking ahead, Joan's victories we can kind of, we can get to the punchline right after Joan's victories. Then that arguably turns the tide of the war, and it doesn't happen all at once, but the French recovery then begins. Paris is recovered, I think, in 1436, and and then by 1453, after certain improvements in siege engines and artillery, the French eventually push England completely out of France, with only Calais being remaining English territory. And that then generates with England, that kind of launches uh, kind of recriminations over this failure, which leads to the Wars of the Roses,
Gotcha.
again famous for English history. So that's a kind of back geopolitical background for Joan.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that and doesn't we don't have to go all the way down this rabbit hole,
Right.
but the whole thing. I mean, I would say anybody that has just kind of a rudimentary understanding or a comprehension of history, European history, understands there is the go back and forth between France and England, however you kind of define the countries and what they might have looked like and who was in charge. They've been going on for such a long period of time that was not,
Right.
it's not like this was a new story, right, on
No,
anybody.
no, that's right.
If you
Really
go all the way
dates.
back to William the Conqueror and kind of,
That's right.
I'm French and yeah,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
no, I'm English, but no, I'm English and you're still part of my France or
Yeah, that's
some of
right.
that. Like,
William is Duke of Normandy, and then becomes King of England. So he's King of England, but vassal to the King of France. So the English have all these, then English kings have these continental land holdings. And that's the ultimate, or the deep background, the deep origin of the Hundred Years' War.
yeah, yeah. Okay, very cool. So let's talk about Joan then, and let's
Right.
talk about this battle at Orleans and what that really was about, or the conflict, I guess we should say,
Yeah.
about how it built towards that. So it was a linchpin of what I'm hearing you say is that, look, if it fell, the what was going to be left of France, or what they had to contend with, was going to probably be very decisive and very, very impactful for them on.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's what happens if the English take Orleans? It's dire. It's really a very dark situation. England, Orleans is under siege. Although the French are still able to supply the city, but it's not going to last much longer. And so she shows up in February at the court, which is meeting, being held. The royal court is at Chinon, in Angevin territory, and she shows up there and asks for an army to go relieve the city and defeat the English. I mean, she sees things in very black and white terms. She's not thinking about, pardon me, she doesn't think about diplomacy. That eventually becomes her undoing. Whereas would have been later on, after these victories, there would be some in the French court who would then say, okay, that's great. That victory is great. Joan, great job, Joan. Now step aside and let's negotiate, right? And she doesn't that's not part of her vocabulary. She's a simple peasant girl, and wants to, see again, headstrong, wants to take the army and attack. Anyway, when she arrives at court, Charles realizing that that someone who comes with a claim to divine revelation, that someone like that, this is not unprecedented um, for uh, for women. In fact, it's often women to come to the court and claim to have revelation from God, and it might be the message might vary. It usually wasn't this sort of political message. Sometimes it had to do with resolving the great schism, the fact that you have two different popes with obediences in various parts of Europe. But Charles realizes that when someone says there's revelation, they're claiming to speak on God's behalf, they have to be vetted because maybe, in fact, the voice in their head is actually uh, from somewhere infernal, so to speak, instead of from a heavenly voice. And so he has her examined by his theologians, and that happens for 3 weeks. We don't have a record of that. Unfortunately, there was a record, it was lost. And then she's approved, she comes back, and he basically gives her sort of gives her an army. She's not the general, she's with the army, she's very much on the front lines, carrying a banner and riding a horse. And she's sent to relieve the city with this army, and arrives in the end of April. And by May 8th, counter to all sort of human expectation, the siege is broken, and the English, instead of fighting, decide to fight another day, and they retreat. Now, what this bare account doesn't capture is the sort of expectation in the French camp for Joan. She was known. People knew about Joan even before she arrived at the battlefield. Word had spread, rumors um, of this maid, as she was called, Pucelle in French. And so when she wins, when this victory happens, this is seen as proof of her divine mission in the French camp. And there is euphoria of a kind that's very uncommon, I think, for when looking back. Our sources, you have to read sort of against the grain of the sources sometimes, but they do communicate that there's a euphoria, and this catches fire, and then a string of victories, um, all the way leading to July, from May 8th to July, a series of victories over. Often it was just French towns under English control that are just or fortresses or cities that are just opening their gates to the French army. And then Charles is crowned in July, and that's the crowning moment, and the high watermark for Joan. She loses in just kind of cutting to the chase for the
Sure.
politics here. In September, she tries to take Paris. Sorry, I think I accidentally touched something.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, that's good. No, you
You want
said she
to
was
want to how do you want to handle this?
taking Paris. No, no, no. We're good.
Okay.
But
Okay.
just so folks know that we are enjoying a great conversation here with Dr. Daniel Hobbins, and we're talking all about things of all Joan of Arc. So what I'm understanding is the vision of going to take Orleans, whichever way we think we're
Uh-huh.
going to be fancy pants and say it, or however it is we want to do it, right? Is that that wasn't like it was a one and done, right? I mean, there were other things she continued to do and continued to
Right.
be a part of because she was this um, leader. I don't know, good luck charm, whatever it is that they were thinking,
Right. Right.
that she was.
Right.
And then things are moving on from the time when Charles is actually crowned, right?
That's right. That's right.
Okay.
Exactly. And so then, pardon me. So again, the defeat at Paris, and then that's when the sort of you might say the voices of diplomacy, those who wanted a truce, because really the real end game for France is the successful end game probably looks like prying Burgundy away from England. And that so that kind of negotiation, again, that's something that Joan couldn't really imagine. She hated the Burgundians, and although she's attacked for that at the trial, but and she's and understandably, she grew up in a town that was probably that certainly was subject to Burgundian raids. She probably saw the soldiers coming through her town and destroying things, and so she just didn't see that wasn't part of the end game. It was just through battle is what she thought. Military success. That's what success looked like, not
Mhm.
diplomatic success. And
Mhm.
so she doesn't then get supported as much. And then the next year in 1430, excuse me, in 1430, she gets captured at Compiègne, another a town that was under French control, but that was being besieged by the English. Goes out on a raid outside the gates, gets caught outside the gates when the signal to retreat is given. Now she's caught by a Burgundian soldier and is handed over eventually to the Duke of Burgundy, who then hands her over to the English. And now she's going to be put on trial. As a I mean, this is where it gets a little complicated. Excuse me. What you have to understand is there are in the medieval world far more than today. There are overlapping legal sort of legal what how to describe them, legal worlds, legal systems, I think we should say, that people are subject to. And so there's civil law, which is the law of the state, and then there's also, no less important, is what we call canon law, which is the law of the church, and that's where uh, the church law has canon law still exists actually in the Roman Catholic Church, but it was far more all-encompassing in the medieval world. So, for instance, anytime when you're as a Christian, if you're unless you're Jewish, when you're brought into the world, when you marry, when you die, all those things are covered by canon law. But not just that. Anytime you walk on the precincts of a monastery, if you have any dealings with Jews, uh, if you are engaging in any sort of belief that is counter to church teaching, that's potentially open to investigation. So all of these things fall under the heading of canon law. And so what happens is the bishop, uh, in whose jurisdiction Joan had been captured, then petitions the King of England for permission to put her on trial for heresy. And the motivation here is clear because if you're
Mhm.
from the English point of view, there's a clear motivation, which is she has helped the King of France recover his realm. Well, what if you can show, in fact, that she's a heretic? That casts doubt, that calls into question the legitimacy of the French king. And so you put her on trial for heresy, you show she's a heretic. Doesn't mean that you have to burn her at the stake, really. And arguably, the better outcome, if you're the King of England, potentially, is she admits that she's a heretic and that she has been deceived by this voice that either she made it up or it was from uh, it was demonic or whatever. And then she for the rest of her life she sits in prison admitting to her mistake. Well, that would seem to be a good result, but in
So we're
fact.
not talking about a military thing. We're just talking about, hey, the military,
Mhm.
the all the conflicts and the battles. We're down to the negotiating of how we're going to kind of settle this whole who's going to
Right.
be where, who's got the legitimacy. Are you even the right guy to
That's
be the
right.
king, or you're not the
That's
king?
right.
If you got here
Exactly.
because of these victories, and the
Yeah.
victories were all heretical, hey, the church has still got this, excommunication card in its back
That's
pocket. And
right.
so, if you don't want to
Yeah,
go
that's right.
there, okay, we've already, so how
That's
that
right.
interplays into this whole kind of geopolitical thing goes back into a myriad of things, right? Between the number of popes or Holy Roman emperors, anybody else
Yeah.
that would have done arm wrestling, right?
No, that's right. It's a very complicated situation. That's
Yeah.
exactly right. And it leads to a lot of confusion, I think, from those who study it, or potentially if you don't keep these competing jurisdictions, these competing legal systems mean, when Joan gets captured as a military, as a prisoner of war, she can just be put to death if they want, and that can always the English hold her as a prisoner of war, and they could either ransom her or you can just execute them, execute a prisoner. And in her case, the the better result for them is again because of her claims to show that she's a heretic. And so,
Mhm.
but to do that, then that means you have to, excuse me, you have to show that you have to demonstrate theologically that what she believes, what she's claimed, um, is heretical.
Mhm.
And so that's a theological task. Even though the motivation for doing this is political, that she's a political enemy. So there's a political motivation, but then at the trial there has to be a theological
Mhm.
demonstration of her of her heresy.
You still got to prove it. I mean,
They
right?
got to
Like you
prove it.
can't just accuse her and go home. You
That's
got to
right.
say,
That's right. But it's a legal system. It falls under the heading of what's called inquisition.
mhm.
Now, don't think of, it's not capital I Inquisition yet. We're not, we don't have a permanent office, like imagine a building and like what you get, in fact, with the Spanish Inquisition. We're not
Right.
there yet. Inquisition is actually just a legal procedure under the heading of canon law, again, to it's just like think of the word inquisition. If you used it today, it means to inquire, right? To
Yeah.
to investigate. And this legal system, again under the heading of church law, is designed. The whole system is designed to elicit uh, confession if the person is actually guilty, because that's the best form of proof. Right. They aren't thinking forensically like our crime labs and provide, because
Right.
we're talking about someone's beliefs or practices um that are heretical. And so you have to demonstrate. The best way to demonstrate that is to get the person to confess, which is also where torture might come into play, and which is legal and is part of the system. So one of the things I think that we're getting at here is one of the tendencies people to say is that this about this trial is that I think is not quite the right way to look at it, is that it was sort of rigged. And what that implies is that the legal system under in which we're operating here is a legal system that, if you observe it, is designed to protect the rights of the accused. And no, it's not. This is medieval canon law. It's designed to produce it's designed to demonstrate heresy. It is not a system that protects the rights of the accused. And so, in other words, once she's caught and put on trial, there's really not any hope for Joan.
Mhm.
This is a system that will absolutely will demonstrate her heresy. I mean, and again, that's not to take a position. That's not to say that I think that she was, I mean, in a way that I think she was wrong by any means, or that certainly that's not to defend that system. In fact, that really what we're saying is this is a horrible system,
Right. Right.
actually,
But
because I think
right.
she's actually convicted legally, and that should be a black mark on that legal system, not on so much on that's not to defend it, that's to actually criticize the legal system.
So unless you're Martin Luther, 100 years later and says, you know what, you can take the whole thing and
He's
and
right.
I don't care. Excommunicate me all day long if you
That's
want.
right.
You don't have the authority to do it. It's not bothering me. Bye.
That's right.
That's I'm obviously oversimplifying it, but I mean it.
Right.
That's not what was going on here during this time period. It still
No.
was very much understood
No,
that
she's a good Catholic.
right.
She's I mean, she's but she does open herself when you start to say as a Catholic that I have a voice telling me to go and attack the enemy. Right there, you're setting aside the question of the veracity of Joan. whether she's telling the truth or not. Just set that aside. When you say that God is essentially that God, or as she says eventually, the in the trial under cross-examination, the saints, Saint Catherine, Saint Margaret, Saint Michael, they have told me to attack the English and the Burgundians. Well, then you have to step back as an observer and say, okay, wait a minute. We're not talking about Christians and pagans. We're talking about Christians fighting Christians. And you're saying God is on the side of one of them in a dynastic conflict. So that's the weak part of
Mm.
Joan's claim, right? That's the weak part that was always, and they knew that, of course, at the trial, her judges and the people in charge. It's the bishop again. Since it's an inquisition, it's the bishop, and then traditionally a Dominican would join, and so there's a Dominican who joins. But they know, and there are all these other what are called assessors, all these other authorities, which could be theologians, canon lawyers, and there are over 100 that participate at various times,
Oh, really? Wow.
and not all at once. Usually sometimes there are only a few, sometimes there are quite a lot, depending on the meeting, and they know, and so some of their cross-examination focuses on this claim that she makes that God is telling her to attack the English, right? Um, so that's the weakness in her claim. And I think that's where there's really not any hope for her on that particular issue. I don't think she could have answered any better than she did. I think she answered really pretty well and conducted herself really with amazing um, poise, from what we can tell. And we could talk a little bit about the sources. We have the trial record uh,
Sure.
where
Oh,
she's
really?
put on. We have the trial record, and we think it's an accurate account of what happened, and she actually comes out of this trial record. I think this is how we know that she's so her courage and her poise and her steadfast belief in her voices. We know all this from this trial record that is actually produced by the judges.
Well,
So
where was the trial,
it,
and how old was she by the time that the trial actually took place,
she,
generally?
yeah, she was probably about 19 when the trial took place.
Wow.
Right, so 19 years old. I mean, and so that means she was arriving at court when she was 17. The trial is held at Rouen in
Oh,
Normandy, so the north
okay.
in English held uh, what we territory, um, and far from far from the actual line of dividing French England from France. So from occupied England, we might
Yeah.
say occupied France, I should say. So she's uh, this goes badly, as anyone could have guessed it would. And then at the end of the trial, after kind of they have a list of things that they're criticizing, or that they are so-called articles of accusation, where that qualify as um, violations of church teaching, including her wearing of male clothing.
Hmm.
Also, some of them centering, of course, on her voice, which again she identifies as these saints. Um, and various other accusations. And at first, when she first is taken out and threatened with the stake, it happens in late May, now 1431. She looking at the pyre where she's going to be burned, and there's a sermon, and they persuade her to renounce her voice, and she is at that point. Um, she's a convicted heretic, all right, at this point, according to church law.
Sure. Right.
Whether we think she's a heretic, that's a separate, more than even the modern church, because she gets canonized in the 20th century. Um, but according to the 15th century church, English church, she's a heretic, and then she goes back to her cell. She renounces her voice, goes back to her cell, and then in the next few hours, the next day or so, she realizes that she has only signed this abjuration out of fear for being burned at the stake. She calls the bishop back in, says, I've made a mistake. I believe my voice, and renounces that abjuration. And then at that point, she's a relapsed heretic, and there's no hope for her. The church then hands her over to civil authorities because the church technically can't, under canon law, they can't inflict any corporal punishment, and certainly not capital punishment.
It's
So
kind of
they
like
hand
it's
her
kind of
over.
like the Romans and the Sanhedrin, right? I mean, it's kind of the you might have
Mhm.
gotten guilty over here, but we don't have the authority to put you to death.
Exactly, exactly.
Mm.
So the but they know, the church authorities, of course, know that she's going to be burned at the stake when they hand her over to the state.
Right.
It's not as though they hand her over to the state and say, "Oh, wonder what they're going to do," right? No, they know, and so she's then burned at the stake. A very sad day for France, and a sad day, I think, for if we step outside our historical objectivity, a sad day for everyone. That things have come to this. That whenever for someone's beliefs that this is happening. But again, it's not historically. It's not surprising. This was always when she was captured. This was always the end game, unless she just spends the rest of her life in prison, admitting that that she had been deceived. This was the only other possible outcome.
Or unless she admitted that I was deceiving you guys all along anyway, right? I mean, it could have been that too, but that certainly. So when you say the voice and the voices and the rest of that and the saints that she claimed that
Right.
she heard from, was that like a one time? What is it that she said she heard? Okay,
Right.
and then was it a one-off, one-time go over there and help get rid of the siege at Orleans and let's be done? Or did she
Right.
believe that she had continual voices that she heard from them as she was proceeding through all the rest of
Right.
whether they were battles, whether she
Right.
was in the trial or whatever?
No, it was continuous. It began
Okay.
when she reached adolescence, and she says in the trial, that this began, and at first the voice. She initially calls it the voice, and then at a certain point, a couple weeks in, or so, a few days in to the trial, she says, under cross-examination, she says it was Saint Catherine, Saint Margaret, Saint Michael, and Saint Gabriel. Um, she says at first it just told her, the voice in her when she was maybe 13 or something. The voice told her to be a good child and to obey her parents and go to church regularly. And then the message changed and told her to go help the King of France, um, and told her of the despair of the people of France. And
Mm.
so it's a very national kind of message at a time when looking at the long arc of history, we think of the 19th century as the great age of nationalism, and that's true. We're not there yet. But there is something to a kind of sense of French and growing sense of national identity, that in the 15th century, this peasant girl is actually thinking of herself as in some ways French, and is certainly not as an enemy of the English. But that voice continues um, to speak to her, and she thinks of it, she describes it as material, as have a material voice, not as just disembodied, but and at a certain point, again, as I said, she starts describing them as the saints. And so they have clothing and hair. They have a certain smell. She sees them, obviously, if she's describing all this. And this continues even during the trial, where she claims to be in communication with her voice. So think she believed that she would be rescued. And this could be the source of, this isn't to undermine her charisma, certainly, but it seems that it would help explain how this 19-year-old girl could maintain this self-confidence. And not just that, I mean, she's like talking down to her judges. Be careful what you say to me. She says it several times
Mm.
during the trial. She's not frail, and that would make sense if she really believed that she was going to be rescued. And then
Right.
she later kind of reinterprets that, her rescue, as her her deliverance from her death. But I think she thought that the king was going to come rescue her, and that would make sense too, in that she didn't quite read the court, the French court,
Yeah,
as you know the fact that Charles kind of had made good use of her and appreciated her for that, ennobled her family for that, gave them tax exemptions. But that's it. Okay, Joan kind of, you're done. Kind of go away, and then she doesn't. So anyway, so um that's the situation with the voice, and again, which becomes saints, and may always have been saints. We don't know. How can we interpret what's
right,
inside?
right,
This is the evidence that we have, and the
right.
way that she describes it.
So how does the canonization happen? Well, I guess maybe this is another two for question. Did the papacy get involved in any of this while any of this is going back, or that's kind of a local matter? I mean, we're not getting into ahead of the bishop, archbishop, or whoever it was that was in charge of, I guess, of the French, the English controlled part of France where this was going on.
Right.
Did they did they get involved in that at any of that time period and kind of interject or that to that? And then the second part of that is, so when they did get involved and
Mhm.
whenever the papacy did get involved on the canonization piece, what did that kind of look like? What was that? When was
Yeah.
that? And how did
Right.
that?
Right.
Who were the
So,
advocates of some sorts? I guess. I mean, why would you go pull the file down again, right?
right,
Unless there
right,
was some reason to do it.
right. So we're dealing here with like 500 over 500 years of history. I think when we talk about when we add canonization to the conversation. So she at first in the original trial, the so-called trial of condemnation, she's uh, the Pierre Cauchon is the bishop in whose jurisdiction she was captured, and so bishops. That's the bishop in the Roman Catholic system is there's an old saying, the bishop is pope in his diocese.
Mm-hmm.
Who is the pope? The pope is the bishop of Rome.
Right.
Now, traditionally, he has this great authority because he's been appealed to, but that's a traditional authority. And the term pope isn't even that's a kind of, that's just a convention. So there's an old tradition that, in fact, that, the each bishop has a kind of equal authority. And we're also at a period when the popes have kind of are their authority is even diminished at this period. We're in this is again back to the larger political scene. So there's no question that the bishop had the authority without the Pope would have agreed with that actually. Now, Joan in the trial, Joan appeals to the Pope, and there was this notion in canon law that you can appeal, uh, but it's unrealistic to think that would just suspend. There are some films that sort of use this, and Joan in the middle of the trial appeals to the Pope, and it throws everything into commotion. Well, what are we going to do now? And no, in she does do that. She does appeal to the Pope, but that was just brushed off. We can't do that. You can't go just stop the trial just because you appeal to the Pope and everything has to grinds to a halt and we have to go ask the Pope. Again, there's that notion of episcopal authority
Mm-hmm.
that this bishop is in control of this trial, and so I don't think it's really a violation. I think to say that that's a violation of canon law to ignore that appeal, I think is to give canon law too much credit. That this is the system again designed to protect the rights of the accused. Okay, so she's put on trial with the bishop in his diocese, Bishop Pierre Cauchon. After the French then, and she's executed. After the French, as a heretic, the French recover. The Hundred Years' War continues. The French recover, and by 1450, the French have now, the English are on their heels and they're on their way out. And so the French king now has this situation. The same king, Charles VII, is still king. Uh, well, Joan, with whose help I reconquered my realm, has been declared a heretic by the church. We can't stand that for this. So there are friends in Rome that can help with this, and so a new procedure, excuse me, is begun to look into or to investigate. It's not, it's a, it's not, to call it a trial. You can call it a trial. It is a trial, but it's not, there's no person is on trial.
Hmm.
What's on trial is the original trial. Is
Gotcha.
was this a legitimate trial according to canon law? And so this is called the nullification trial, because the
Okay.
goal is to nullify the original verdict. And then the number of witnesses are interviewed, and in the end, again, wasn't no one surprised should be surprised at what ends up happening, that they nullify the original verdict. And they actually have one of the original manuscripts of the trial that they ceremonially destroy at that point.
Hmm.
It's at the end of that procedure. Okay, so, but we're not talking yet in 1456 when this happens about canonizing Joan. That is a modern conversation. It's
Okay.
not until the 19th century. Let's think what happens in French history. Okay, we get the French Revolution, 1789, 19th century France. The winds of nationalism are blowing. Jules Michelet is writing his history of France, and in a kind of nationalist vein, where France is now there's a notion of France that wasn't there in the 15th century, and Joan, not surprisingly, is thought of as one of the great heroines of this story. And so now, with French nationalism and sweeping the country, and changes in attitudes also in Catholicism. Looking at someone like Joan, now there's finally a movement, and there had been always a kind of support for Joan. Kind of, there were these annual sort of discourses given in Orleans, um, and this kind of all builds kind of momentum to reopen the uh, the case of Joan for, well, or open a new case on Joan, I should say, because you can't like necessarily, she was burned at the stake. That's done. You can't reopen that, but you can say maybe Joan was actually a saint. And so that's what happens, and it goes on. It begins in the late 19th century, and then that leads to her beatification in 1907, and to her
Hmm.
canonization then in 1920, I believe, 1919, 1920. But that was a process. That's, again, that's 500 years almost.
Right.
So it's a long, and it's something that takes, again, um, that you have to read as part of the history of modern France, and not really part of Joan's own moment. Those are two sort of different historical moments.
Yeah. Wow. What an interesting character all the way around, right? I mean, there's just so much more to it than,
There's a lot to
than
it. Yeah.
than just, I mean, you could look at it in any any myriad of different ways that you would be able to, as we might say, skin the cat, right? I mean, to be able to think about
That's
everything from the
right.
religious piece to, was it canon law, where did that fit into with civil
Mhm.
law? How did that fit into the geopolitical pieces and parts of what's going on between kingdoms and others to be able to do? And she's smack in the middle of
Right.
all that, right?
That's right.
So,
Yeah.
yeah.
She's a fascinating character, fascinating story. Um, and I encourage people to read more about her. You can get the trial itself. There's a fine biography I recommend by Helen Castor. Um, and there are other biographies. There's a lot out there, but you can also read the original accounts for yourselves. They've been
Wow.
translated into English.
Very cool. Very cool. Dr. Dan Hobbins, thank you so much for spending time with us today, and really, really opening our eyes up on a host of different things to think about, all of it surrounding of Joan of Arc. So
My pleasure. Thank
thanks
you.
for your
Thank you for
time.
having me.